Second reading. This is going to be from Matthew chapter 14, 13 through 21. It's again the feeding of the 5,000. And it starts off with what every English teacher would circle on your paper and say, this is not understandable. So when it says this and it, I'm going to pause for a moment and tell you what this and it is so that it makes sense as we read through this. So, now, when Jesus heard this is actually the death of John the Baptist, his cousin. Right? So now when Jesus heard of John the Baptist's death, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. When the crowds heard it, now this it is that Jesus had left and gone the other side of the lake. When the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place. The hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." The disciples replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." And Jesus said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves, the 2 fish, he looked up to the heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Appears in all 4 Gospels, this story, often titled Feeding of the 5,000. It's in all 4, therefore it must be important. Matthew's version here is a little different in that it both, one, recalls Israel's exodus from Egypt, and 2, foreshadows the Last Supper. So we have both of those events embedded here. That is obviously appropriate for us on a day when we're going to celebrate the Lord's Supper. Framing the feeding around these 2 pivotal events, the Exodus and the Last Supper, allows Matthew to draw a parallel between God's saving the Israelites from the Egyptian slavery and Jesus saving the people from their sins. Important, it is almost always, it is there also for us to learn in our own day. Just as we see the disciples learning about their role in Jesus' coming absence, we learn about our roles. Now, there's some irony, some contrast in Matthew's presentation of the feeding, putting it in the context of the Exodus. Just before this event, Jesus is trying to separate himself from the crowds, goes across the lake in a boat. He has just learned of the death by beheading of his cousin. We call him John the Baptizer. At the order of Herod, John has been arrested and beheaded in prison. Now, in contrast to this devastating event, in the Exodus, God had worked through Moses and Aaron to free the Hebrews from bondage under Pharaoh. This is a positive. They were being set free. Yet here in Matthew, John's arrest and death at the hands of Herod anticipates Jesus' own judgment and crucifixion by Pilate. John, Jesus, the other followers never experienced the physical liberation that Moses and his people experienced or enjoyed in the Exodus. They experienced death. And still, Matthew frames the feeding of the 5,000 as an Exodus moment. He does not suggest that Jesus' presence and power in the lives of his followers is on par with God's own work on behalf of the enslaved Israelites, as told in the story of the Exodus. I said that wrong. He does suggest that this is a parallel to the story of the Exodus. These two events are at the same level of importance. Note there's celebration and liberation in the feeding, like in the Exodus. The food that Christ provides is a foretaste of freedom, granting freedom from sins that he will forecast for his disciples at the Last Supper to come later. Jesus is, of course, the central character. Right here in Matthew 13, we see the role of Jesus shifting from teacher to a miracle worker. Matthew tells us Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and curing every disease and every sickness among the people. The result? Large crowds follow him. Why would they not? After hearing the news of John's death, Jesus tries to leave the crowds by taking a boat across the lake. As we already pointed out, that doesn't work. The crowds follow him on foot. The outcome will be one of Jesus' most recognized miracles, feeding the 5,000. But it only occurs after the tired Jesus once again spends time teaching and healing the sick people. The tired, perhaps discouraged Jesus, after seeing the crowds, felt compassion for them. We often jump to the miracle, but overlook the sympathy that literally moves Jesus. Jesus' compassion challenges him, causes him to act. So too it should be for us. While we may feel sympathy for someone, how often does that emotion result in action? Jesus cures the sick people in the crowd because he cared for them. Must have taken a while. His disciples come to him and suggest it's the end of the day. He should wrap it up and send the crowd home. Those disciples always there doing the practical things. Looking at this from the disciples' perspective, this is not an uncaring act. They are not being malicious. They simply aware that they perceive the reality of the situation. Their reality is their location. Deserted place. No McDonald's, no Wendy's, even in sight. Couldn't believe that in our time, of course. And the time of day. The day is turning to evening. And the resources. They have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Jesus says to the disciples what must have seemed ridiculous to them. They, the people, need not go away. You give them something to eat. What would you see if you were a disciple at that point? It's getting late. The people are probably starting to get hungry. The children are restless. The disciples must have been perplexed. Jesus, in return, seems perplexed by the disciples' request to send the people away. Why would they leave when the disciples had food, Jesus thinks? Then the miracle occurs. Jesus feeds more than 5,000 men, women, and children. Now, this miracle is, of course, widely studied by scholars. Some scholars focus on the blessing of the loaves and the bread. They suggest this miracle is perhaps a precursor to our communion meal. And that's fine. Some scholars focus on the satisfied crowds or the symbolism of the 12 full baskets of leftovers. And that's fine. Yet there's at least one more detail of note. Jesus did not send the people away. This is also remarkable. Instead of doing the expedient thing and commanding them to leave, he orders them to stay and sit down on the grass. He gets on to continuing the work he has come to do, curing every disease and sickness among the people, but not without assigning and enabling his disciples to feed the people. You think just maybe those disciples think this multiplication of loaves of bread and fish may even tie back to the previous parable Jesus has spoken to them concerning the mustard seed. The kingdom of heaven produces a plentiful harvest from the smallest of seeds, or from a few loaves of bread and a couple fish. This miracle demonstrates that Jesus does attend to the physical needs of the people. He does not solely focus on the spiritual need through his teaching. He is also concerned that they are sick. He has empathy with them for those who are hungry. We should ask, as Christians today, are we as concerned about the physical health of God's people as Jesus? Or do we focus solely on their spiritual health? We do, like the disciples, naively send people away when we think our resources are too limited to have impact. Or do we do that? Naively send people away? Hold on to that question. Do we naively send people away? I'm going to shift gears on you for a minute or two here. This would seem to be a good time to go back and remind ourselves of a commitment we made in the PC era. Now, that's not the political correct era. That's the pre-COVID era. We as a church made a commitment to be part of the PCUSA Matthew 25 movement. We committed to embrace the three focal points of the Matthew 25 program: building congregational vitality by challenging people and congregations to deepen their faith and get actively and joyfully engaged with their community and with the world. We committed to dismantling structural racism by advocating and acting to break down systems, practices, and thinking that underlie discrimination, bias, prejudice, and oppression. We committed to eradicating systemic poverty by working to change laws, policies, and plans and structures in our society that perpetuate economic exploitation. We committed to those three. Now, I know the COVID epidemic put a kink in a lot of our plans and caused us to divert much of our energy. But I think in reflection, the action of our Deacon and Mission Board at its last meeting represents to me us getting back on track. I'd like to highlight three programs that they have decided that they and we as a church should entertain or undertake and be fully engaged in. So first, Yvonne, my spouse, brought to attention of the board a need from a program she is involved with at the Franklin County Jail Early Release Training Program. In this program, inmates participating in instructional programs, including a GED program and a parenting program that she is part of, are required to somehow purchase notebooks to take notes in or write in. This type of need is not covered by the jail's system. Yvonne asked the managers of the jail programs if notebooks could be donated. And the short answer is yes. The short version of the outcome is that the board, our Deacon and Mission Board, decided this would be a project they, as the board members themselves, would take on personally. So as I speak, Yvonne has delivered the first 120 composition notebooks. They were in the back of her wheels till earlier this week when she delivered them to the Franklin County Jail system, about enough to handle them for a quarter. Obviously, with back to school sales, we hit the ideal time to buy composition notebooks. The second program, through the Presbyterian newsletter, we became aware of the Hygiene Connection program at the Overbrook Church, one of their Matthew 25 ministries. The Hygiene Connection is currently providing its partner agencies, that's the Clintonville Resource Center, Neighborhood Services, and NEMAP, supplying those agencies with over 1,200 personal care items every 2 weeks. 1,200 every 2 weeks. They cannot keep up. Donations from other congregation or individuals are needed to help them meet this ever-growing need. It's a real need. Did you know that the average family of 5 spends about $100 a month on basic hygiene and personal care needs? And the SNAP benefits, the federal benefits, do not cover hygiene products such as soap, shampoo, toilet paper, pads, tampons, toothpaste. We have added a collection bin for hygiene items next to the red wagon for our food items. So in the annex, you can place food items in the red wagon. You can place hygiene items in a bin beside it. This will be an ongoing effort obviously in parallel with our food pantry collection. You can contribute to either or both. But there's more. The third I would highlight is the reestablishment of our winter coat drive. New or gently used coats for all ages from kindergarten to high school will be accepted now through September 30th. All coats will go to the Capital City Helping Hands Coat Drive. This is a coat drive or collaboration across a number of Presbyterian churches in the Columbus area. Most of the coats, I think all of them actually go to within the Columbus schools. They do not have to be new. The criteria we were given is if you would give one of your kids or grandkids to wear to school, it should be fine. We intend to use the coat rack in the entry as our collection point, so you can contribute new or used coats there between now and September 30th. Needless to say, we had a lively Deacon and Mission Board meeting. So check your August newsletter, should be out shortly for more details on this, and you can contribute to either of these latter two items. And oh, by the way, our next Deacon and Mission Board meeting is at noon, August 30th, if you want to join this small but mighty group. Well, let me bring this back to our biblical context. Last week, we considered Jesus teaching the crowds and instructing his disciples about the kingdom of heaven. He gave us metaphors for what that kingdom is like. It is like the most common of things through which we can see the kingdom. In our text today, Jesus makes the kingdom of heaven real through his acts of healing and performing miracles. He shows us that the kingdom of heaven is not there. In the kingdom of heaven, there is compassion. People share resources. There's more than enough for everyone. The disciples and we, like Jesus, can be moved to compassion and to attend to both the spiritual and the physical needs of God's people. Perhaps we can actually see the kingdom of heaven through notebooks, through food in the red wagon, through hygiene products, through a warm winter coat. The kingdom of God is like. Amen.